Hello, my name is Alexis Bloodsworth, and I am a second-year law student at Penn State Law. I am currently in the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. For the lab's Witnesses to Herstory project, we are capturing the personal experiences of women during a transformative era in the United States. So today I have the privilege of welcoming Miss Ernestine Hayes, who's agreed to share her story as part of our project. She is a mother, grandmother, and a retired professor. So thank you so much, Ms. Hayes, for joining me. I'm looking forward to speaking with you today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. And let me correct very quickly, I'm also a great grandmother.
Oh, wow. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with your childhood. So I know that you were born in 1945. Where were you born?
I was born in Juneau, Alaska, when Alaska was still a territory.
Did you live there your whole childhood?
I I lived for the first few years of my life with my grandmother in the Juneau Indian Village, which is downtown Juneau. And I lived with her on the edge of the village there in our old family house while my mother was in and out of the hospital for tuberculosis. So when she finally came back, I must have been around 6 or so because I was already um, going to school, kindergarten or first grade. And we lived in the old house for a while. And then my mother and I moved to our own little places in Juneau. Um, and when I was 8 years old, my mother and I spent a year in Tacoma while she learned how to type and take shorthand. And then we went back home until I was 15, almost 16. And then we moved to California.
Okay. So you said that you lived with your grandmother for a few years. Do you have any siblings that lived in the house with you?
No, I was my mother's only child, and I was my grandmother's first grandchild, and her other children were a few years older than me.
And so what did your mom do for work when she got out of the hospital?
Well, before and in her intermittent releases from the hospital, and then after she came back home, before we went to Tacoma, she did things like work in the cannery and slime fish and be a janitress at local buildings. And I think she waitressed, but I think she did that before I was born. So she did whatever was available to women of her position in the territory of Alaska in the 1950s.
Did your grandmother work?
My grandmother worked in the canneries every summer. And I don't believe she worked during the winters, except whatever cannery work may have come up. But my grandmother worked in the canneries.
Is that what you saw a lot of women in your community doing when you were a kid?
A lot of Native women worked in canneries. And then I'm speaking of Native women of our position. There were, of course, other Native women and Native families who, had received more formal Western education, had repositioned their family status to be more of benefit in the colonial system.
And so when you say Native women of your position, do you mean like economically?
Yes, economically, our position in Western society, which was in many cases completely different, and certainly always ignorant of any position that had already existed in the indigenous culture.
Okay, so I know that you started elementary school in 1951, is that correct?
Somewhere around there.
Okay. Did you attend a private school or a public school?
Oh, public school.
Did you have a dress code there?
Um, little girls were supposed to wear skirts, I suppose. Uh, I came from my family was of poverty and intermittent work, and not much income, and we lived in town, so we didn't do a whole lot of subsistence. And I had only my grandmother in my family. When my mother was in the hospital, my grandparents drank, and uh, I wasn't often a clean, polished little girl, skipping to school in my pinafore, so any dress code that may have turned my way was probably more often, I should wear clean clothes rather than, am I dressing correctly?
So I read in your memoir, Blonde Indian, that your elementary teacher divided the students into seagulls, wrens, and bluebirds. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about that?
Well, it was just levels of reading in those early days. Of course, uh, things were far more well, they were different. And I believe it was because the stage of educating uh, people in the territory was beginning, and the purpose of education is in my experience certainly not to educate. And so the lessons I learned were more of my position in the new society. And because of that, I believe, um, my ability wasn't recognized, because recognizing my ability and nurturing it was not the purpose in the early territorial days, because we were still actively being colonized. So I think it was just part of how a little, native girl who comes from the village it needs what my place was in that system.
So what group were you divided into?
Oh, I was always on the lowest group. I loved to read. When my mother came back, she was a great reader, and I was her only child, and so I read. Uh, I was never advanced to the bluebirds. I may have advanced to the neutral one, but I was, never recognized to be of greater ability than the other little girls whose social standing my position did not exceed, if I said that diplomatically enough.
How did that make you feel?
I thought that was the world. I was a little girl. When you're a child, you just think everything is the way everything is. And so I got the message and I believed it.
And did you ever talk to anyone about it?
When I was little,
Yeah.
no. Oh, no. No. What would I say? What could I have said? I'm I'm being treated like a little native girl from the village. I thought that was the world. And it didn't really bother me as much as, it may sound. Um, uh, I went to school because it was compulsive and I was sent.
So was your teacher a male or a woman?
In the early grades, they were women, but I remember when I was in sixth grade, I had a male teacher, Mr. Parks. I still remember him. But before that and after that, it was women teachers.
So you said that you moved to Tacoma for fourth grade. So what year was that?
I think it was in 1954, I believe, because when I came back home, I was in fifth grade, and I think that was 1955 when I was 10. Um, so it works out to me that it was 1954 and I was in fourth grade. I
Okay.
remember I was in fourth grade.
And you said you moved there because your mother was learning to type?
Yes.
Okay. Did you notice any differences in your school in Tacoma than your school in Juneau?
Well, for sure. The school in Tacoma was torture. In going to school in the territory of Alaska in Juneau, coming from the village, I knew my place, even if it was at the bottom of everything. I still at least knew my place. When I went to Tacoma, my mother and I ended up living with my uncle Eugene and his wife Melba, and we lived about a block from school down the hill, and my uncle Eugene was blind and used a cane, and his wife Melba was blind and had a guide dog, and my mother full-blooded Tlingit, and as I recall, I was the only Alaska Native little girl in the school. In fact, I believe I was the only non-white in that particular neighborhood. I don't remember having any friends. I don't remember seeing anyone who looked like me. Um, and I do remember being picked on and bullied to the point where uh, I was sick every morning and didn't want to go to school. It was terrible. Fourth grade was terrible.
So it sounds like you were ready definitely to go back to Juneau.
I was so glad to go back home.
So what year did you start high school?
Um, I should have been in the class of 63. So what would that be? 1959 when I was 14. And it was around about the same time I got sent away a couple of times. And then I somehow finished ninth grade, I think probably when I was in the boarding homes. And then I came back to Juneau. I was allowed to go back to Juneau, and I dropped out before I finished 10th grade.
Okay. And so you said when you were 14, you were sent away to one of the boarding homes. Um, can you tell our audience just generally kind of what that is?
Well, it's a long tradition in the United States to take children and to take indigenous children and put them somewhere so that they can become assimilated or indoctrinated into their place in Western society. And usually that was done with younger children, but in my case, I wasn't taken till I was like 13 or 14, and by then I was wild. I had no supervision. I was just tearing up the town and burning it down, and I was just continually getting into trouble and acting out. And so they put me on probation. They gave me a probation officer. They, or tried to order my life, and then they just sent me away. And they sent me to Haynes House at the beginning, and I ran away from that and was. Then when they caught me, they sent me to Valdez, and I stayed there for a year and went back home and kept burning the town down. So my mother just gave up and took me to California.
So when you say that they took you away, was it actually someone that came to your home to come get you?
Yeah, yeah. They, or arrange it. They arrange it and take you. I think they took me the first time. They took me out the road to the ferry, and I got on the ferry, and they took me up to Haynes on the ferry.
What was it like? What was your experience like being there?
It was in the first time, it was very, very different for me because I had really had no structure, no supervision, no rules, no anything, completely unsupervised. Uh, and then I went to Haynes House, which was like probably all other boarding homes was run by Christian missionaries, and they grew their own garden, and the children there had to work in the garden, had to wash dishes, had to clean up after the pastor and his wife and family, had to pour them coffee and serve them when they were eating, and just tend to them. And there were rules, so it was completely different for me.
Did you know anyone else? Excuse me, sorry, let me just start that over. Did you know anyone else from your village that had been sent to Haynes House?
I knew subsequently of people who had also been there, but at the time, no, I don't remember. I don't remember knowing anyone that I had already known.
So you then went back to Juneau, and you said you and your mother moved to California. And so that would have been in 1961, correct? You were 16?
Yes, right before I turned 16, we went to California.
Okay. And then can you remind me, why did you two move to California?
We went to California because I imagine, I can only assume it was because my mother didn't know what else to do. And I was constantly getting in trouble. I wasn't going to school. I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't being controlled at all. And I imagine she just wanted to get out of town and had to take me with her. And that was pretty much what happened.
Where in California did you go?
We went to San Francisco, and she was working for the government. I think I think we went down to Los Angeles for a little while because my aunt was living there. I remember having time with her, but we settled in San Francisco.
And what did your mom do for work when you guys got to San Francisco?
Well, because in 1954 she had learned to type and take shorthand, which was under a federal government program directed at Native American people to urbanize them. And so since 1955, when we had gone back to Juneau after she learned clerical skills, she had worked in offices. And so she actually, her first jobs were for the territorial government, working for statehood. And after that, she began working in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which had Native preference for its entry level positions. And so she was a clerk for the federal government Bureau of Indian Affairs from then on.
And so what did you do when you guys first got to California?
I ran around. Tried to start school, but I dropped out again. Everything was different. Everybody was different. Everybody had teased hair that I didn't know how to do, and it was just the same story, except in a bigger city.
So you got your GED when you were 18 then in 1963, is that correct?
Yes, I got my GED. I can't remember. It must have been 63 or 64. I got a GED and enrolled in business college, again under Bureau of Indian Affairs program.
And why did you choose the business college?
It was pretty much the only thing offered. The program the federal program that sends indigenous people to learn it, to receive an education is in every case the degree needs to be in a service occupation. So it's 1 or 2 years. So learning to type, like my mother had done, was just part of the policy.
So your program at the business college was 1 year?
1 year, yes. I was learning bookkeeping and typing and clerical skills.
Okay. And is that what you did for work after you finished that program?
Yes.
So you had your first child in 1965 and your second in 1967, right?
Yes.
Okay. Did you always know that you wanted children?
I didn't know there was a choice, except for, I'm sure I realized that total abstinence would keep me from having children, but I guess I was of the generation that thought that was just simply a woman's destiny. Um, there. I don't believe I thought there was a choice.
Do you think that you got that expectation from society more generally or from someone in your family?
What expectation are you referring to?
The expectation that you would have children.
Oh, I'm sure from media, everything that's presented as a woman's place in Western society is to function as a baby maker. At the time, it was mid 1950s, have babies and mop the floor. And if you were not of the dominant class, and if you were not of a benefited station, then you had to learn how to type.
Give me just 1 second. Okay, so did you get married at the time that you had your children or no?
I was in and out of relationships, and I don't believe, I know when I was a child in Juneau, I never went to any weddings or heard newses of any bridal showers or whatever happens when people get married. So I'm not sure even that whole concept of, Western classification of how you identify relationships. Marriage just never was. I guess I never really absorbed the significance of it.
So moving back just a little bit, I remember earlier you mentioned that you like to read, and I meant to ask you about that. So what did you like to read?
I read everything. My mother always had a magazine or a paperback book that she was reading, and I I remember going to the city library, which was very, very small um, at the time, and just reading everything there. And I remember it being a warm building on a winter day. And I have I have a good memory of that. And that building is still there, although obviously it's not the library anymore. And I just, when I went home and my mother had a book in her hand, and I read.
Did you like to listen to any music or watch movies or TV shows?
Well, after I turned like 11 or 12, um, even 55, 56, and I fell in love with Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and Bill Haley. And I mean, that was when rock and roll reached even Alaska, even reached Indian Village in Juneau, Alaska. And so, yeah, music. But my mother she bought me a little record player. And when she bought me a present, I don't know whether it would have been for Christmas, I imagine, she bought me a record player, and I remember little 45 discs by people like Pat Boone. When mine was like Jerry Lee Lewis, I wanted the rock and roll, and she wanted me. I think she was probably one of her last hopes, that I would become a little girl that liked Pat Boone.
So, okay, so sorry about that. Moving back to California. Did you like being in California?
I remember, I have some good memories of it, but I always wanted to come back home.
So how long did you stay in California?
I was in California for 25 long years.
And so when did you decide to make the move back to Juneau?
Well, I had already tried a couple of times. One time I got as far as British Columbia, but I slid back down the coast. And I had always said, maybe one of these days I'll go home. And I was living this disorganized life there as I already had when I was young. And my children were almost grown. And my life was in shambles. I was just lost. And when I turned 40, I said, let me go home or let me die on the way. And so I was broke, and I was living in the Sierra Nevada foothills, but I was homeless. I was jumping around from my mother's couch to, some other people's, and I took my old car and went, not for the first time, went to San Francisco, where I was homeless that summer, not for the first time in San Francisco. And when summer was over, I headed north.
And how long did it take you to get back to Juneau once you started traveling?
It took me 8 months to get from San Francisco to Ketchikan, living in my car, standing in food lines, and sleeping in shelters. And I wintered in Eureka, California. And then on the new year, January 1st, I drove up to Seattle, and I stayed in Seattle homeless, living in my car until May. And during which time I, took advantage of everything I could to gather enough money to get on the ferry and make it as far as I could, which was Ketchikan. And I stayed in Ketchikan for 2 years. And then During that time, I sent for my mother, I sent for my sons. After camping out for a few months, I got a job, got a place to live, and 2 years later, we made it back home to Juneau.
So how far is Ketchikan from Juneau?
It's about, I don't know, like maybe 90 miles or something like that, but you can't drive to either town. You can only fly or go by boat. You can't drive. So I'm just guessing
Right.
the miles, because that has pretty much no context in traveling. In Southeast Alaska, it's all by, you either have to go by boat or by plane, and then of course when the weather hits and you can't do either, you're just staying in town.
Okay. So you mentioned that you got a job when you got to Ketchikan. What were you doing when you got there?
I first went to work for Ketchikan Indian Corporation, clerical, and then I moved over to the Alaska court system, where I was a court clerk in the court system there. And then when I went to Juneau, when I went to Juneau, I got a job at the Native Corporation, and then at a legal service. I was a paralegal. No, not a para. Can't remember. I don't know. I was a paralegal support for a legal. So I jumped around.
And when you were working in like the court system, were there any other women that were working there with you?
In Ketchikan? Oh, yeah. And in fact, all the court clerks, and there were like maybe 4 or 5 of them, were women. And it was the only time in my life, and almost one of the only times in my life, that I knew someone named Ernestine.
Oh. So when you got back to Juneau, you were happy to be back?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I was home.
Yeah. So you started working on your bachelor's degree then when you turned 50, is that correct?
Yes, I'd always said, one of these days maybe I'll go to college, even though I'd never even finished 10th grade. And so when I turned 50, I found that old GED from, the 1960s. And this was in the 1990s. And I couldn't enroll at the university unless I had my GED. And I wrote back to San Francisco somehow to the right person, and this was even before big Wi-Fi and stuff. And I wrote to them, and they wrote me back and said somehow they had found those records in an old filing cabinet from decades before, and they came up with my GED, and I was allowed to register for a 2-year program at the university, because it was, to have only a GED, you couldn't just immediately begin in their 4-year, and plus the native corporations administer federal money. They pass through those programs that used to come directly to the person to go to school and stuff. And so, but it was still the same parameters. So I could only register for a 2-year program.
Okay. And what school was that at?
University of Alaska Southeast here in Juneau.
What were you majoring in?
I signed up for a paralegal program because that was the 2-year program that appealed to me, and I signed up for that program. And then at the end of 2 years, my original funding was no longer available, because the federal money is only for 2 years for Native people. But I didn't feel like I was ready to stop. I wanted to switch over to a longer degree, and so I switched over to a 4-year degree in some general 4-year degree with an emphasis in communications, and started living on scholarships and student loans and summer work.
What did you work during? What did you do during the summer for work?
During the summers, every summer that I attended college, I worked on the waters of Southeast Alaska.
What were you doing on the water?
At first, I was a culturalist on one of the local Urban Native Corporation. I'm not a member of them, but I got a job on one of their boats as a culturalist, and with a 5-day itinerary, round and round and round all summer. And then the next summer, I got a job with whale watching. So I was on working for a whale watching outfit during the summer. And then the next year, and from then on, I was a culturalist or naturalist onboard naturalist for the Forest Service on the Alaska State Ferries.
Did you like being on the water during the summer?
Oh yeah, I loved it. There are very few things that I would give it up for. It was the best thing I ever did. I think Tlingit people are meant to be on the water.
So let's see. After you got your bachelor's degree, I know then you went to work on your master's degree. So what year did you start doing that?
Well, I had not I had not planned to go beyond my bachelor's degree, because at the time UAS was not offering anything that I wanted, and I didn't want to leave Juneau. But I was selected as one of the student to present the student response at graduation. And I borrowed a button blanket from another Eagle woman, and I went up to the podium and gave a 5-minute response, and I received my first standing ovation. And I fell in love with myself. I fell in love with my own words, and went to work on the state ferry. All the scholarship applications, program, everything had passed. All the deadlines had passed. And I spent the whole summer just 6 feet off the ground because I was so, I was such a hot deal. I got a standing ovation. And when the summer was over, I found myself in Anchorage in their MFA program, learning to write.
So is that the time that you got a standing ovation, is that kind of what prompted your interest in writing, or had you had that interest before?
Oh, I'd had the interest in writing ever since I was a little girl because I read, and that's how you become a writer. But it didn't prompt my interest in writing. It simply convinced me that I don't know if it convinced me. It just gave me a taste for another standing ovation, for recognition of my writing, for recognition of my ability. I don't, that really is something that I hadn't really ever received.
So it sounds like you were really proud of yourself.
Yeah, I was impressed by myself.
Yeah. So did you like the program that you were in, your MFA program?
Yeah, I think so. I had nothing to compare it to. My main advisor, Sherry Simpson, was an Alaskan woman. She wasn't Native. There was another Native person in the program, but I never had classes with her because she was a year or two ahead of me. I was the only Native person. It makes writing workshop difficult when when others cannot allow themselves to look at your writing through a different perspective or point of view. So there were challenges, but all in all, I learned a lot, and I was gratified to be in the program, and I so appreciated my advisor.
So you said that some of the other students in your writing workshop weren't looking at your writing through a different point of view. Do you mean that they were looking at your writing through a non-native point of view?
Right.
Okay. So after you graduated with your MFA, you started as an adjunct professor. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And where were you teaching at?
UAS, and I skedaddled back to Juneau every summer as soon as I could. And then when I got my MFA, I didn't even stay in Anchorage long enough to participate in the graduation. I just went home. And that fall, I began teaching as an adjunct at UAS.
What were you teaching?
I was teaching see, at the very beginning, I was teaching creative writing. I think at the very beginning, I was just only teaching creative writing, and then after I think a year, they needed someone to teach Alaska literature, and it was an unexpected need. Actually, the person that was supposed to teach the class had only been in Alaska 1 year, and resigned to go back to California, and so they suddenly needed someone with very short notice who to teach the class, and I was available, and I had told the person in charge of the department that I couldn't go on with just one class much longer because I needed to support myself. And so they gave me that class because no one else was available, although the class was actually, its full title was Alaska Literature, Native and Non-Native Perspectives. And the person who had been assigned was a non-Native person who had been in Alaska for 1 year and then left. And so it was an opportunity for me to not only offer an Alaska Native perspective, but also to teach it.
Did you like teaching that class?
Yes, I appreciated the opportunity to present a non-Western view, although admittedly, and something I was constantly aware of, was that all my schooling had been through a Western lens.
So what literature was part of the class?
Well, let's see, it was years and years ago. We compared, we began with, let's see, we began, I think this is, yeah. We began with ancient stories and stories from Tlingit point of view. And this is Ha Shuka, our ancestors' Tlingit oral narratives. And what it has, it was so Nora Marks Downhour, whose first language was Tlingit, she went around to the villages for years, recording the oratory and speeches at various ceremonies. And then she devised a way, because it's an oral language, and so there was no written language, there was no way to write it yet. And she devised a way to write it down using, the European alphabet, because there was pretty much no choice, I guess. And so then she wrote these stories down in Tlingit language, according to her own her own method of how to spell and so on, because there's almost 20 sounds in the Tlingit language that don't appear in English. So that alone was a challenge. Yeah. And then so she has the Tlingit on this side, and then the English on the other side. And it begins with, it's in chronological order, and it begins with a story called Basket Bay. And then it goes through how mosquitoes came to be, how killer whales came to be, the woman who married a bear, and it ends with the coming of the first white man. And so we use this book to begin, for sure. I can't really remember the other Native writings because at the time, it was the early 2000s, and there still wasn't a lot of Alaska Native contemporary writing.
Were many of your students Native as well?
My students in the in the first and second year, there were more Native students in the first and second year. By the time you got to third and fourth year, there weren't that many Native students, because it reflects the society. It reflects the culture that we live in.
So I know that you also designed and executed a different class for Native and other minority students. Will you tell me more about that class that you designed?
Yes, after I was allowed to be full-time, for first several years, I was a term appointment, not on tenure track, but just allowed to come back and teach. And like most colleges, I would expect, the first year students who came to us underserved were students of poverty and students of color. But at least they had escaped the prison pipeline. But they showed up after jumping through every kind of hoop you can imagine, going through all kinds of paperwork, being underserved all through high school and in the years before. And they finally made it to where they could register for classes, and they would take a placement test, and too many of students from poverty, and especially students of color and primarily Alaska Native students, tested into pre-college level. And the pre-college classes, the pre-college composition classes at that university were 4 credits, whereas the ordinary college level classes were 3 credits. And so right off the bat, they had to pay extra to to be penalized for arriving at college underserved by the high school system. And then they would, four credits for fall semester, and the ones who had tested into the lower pre-college had to take another 4 credits in the spring. So 8 credits gone, and the program that sends Native students to school will only cover certain times, certain credits, and so there goes, you know, your whole first year. You have to wait a whole summer, and during your second year, get into college level composition. And that just discourages everybody, as far as I can tell. So I designed a program where they had to come to class 2 hours a day, 4 days a week, and they could not skip class. And we did 8 credits during the first semester, and they successfully advanced to college level composition in the second semester, and had so much greater chance to remain in college and return the next year. It was accelerated composition, and the students who attended, I always had a full class, and all of them, the ones that made it past midterm, because at midterm, at the last day that they could switch to another class or drop or something, I would make sure that they were in a better position. And then at midterm, those who looked like they were not going to succeed the second half, but they completed the first half successfully, gained those 4 credits, and it was up to them if they wanted to continue and take on the next. And most of them did, as I recall, and everyone who did passed. And it was a class where at the end they had to produce a portfolio of their writing, which was 3 essays, one of them that had at least 2 drafts showing the changes they had made with the professor's notes and other their visits to the writing center and so on. And those portfolios were read and scored by other teachers, other composition teachers throughout the system. So it wasn't up to me whether they passed or not. It was a blind, anonymous grading, and they passed. I was very, I was proud of my students.
So it seems like that really helped with because like you said, it was discouraging to have to wait an entire summer after the entire year to just start those college classes. So did you notice that made a big difference in a lot of those students' lives?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, although it's all well and good to say, you know, all my students passed their portfolio, the real test is the grade that they receive in the college level class when they go on. You know, whatever you're teaching, good for you, but the test is how well do they do in the class that is a prerequisite for. And so yeah, they went on, and the 111 college level composition teachers were found it not difficult to recognize the students who had come through my classes, the accelerated classes, because we were on a schedule. We were very strict. We had to do what we had to do and get it done when it was due. And even that was a difference, because you know, for example, in high school, I'm sure they were just allowed to go ahead and you know, pass on through. Nobody forced them to uh, turn in papers or spent extra time. It was just too difficult. And so the ones that made it through my class, at the very least, understood that success is 90, I think I used to tell them the formula was 1% ability, 1% luck, 1% who you know, and 97% determination. And I would give my example of coming home, like walking part of the way from California and coming back to college at the age of 50 and telling them the only thing that got me through was the same thing that's going to get you through, and that's determination.
Did you receive a lot of support for that program from other teachers in the school?
No, no. When I first got there, not when I think when I first began full-time teaching, I was the only Native professor in humanities, as I recall. And then they hired one other Native person to teach language and so on. So I became the only Native professor in humanities teaching a general education requirement. But most professors at a university prefer to teach third and fourth year courses, and certainly don't see themselves teaching pre-college classes, right? That's not what non-native professors who get their education down south dream of coming to Alaska to teach pre-level college courses. So no. I mean, they thanked me and praised me and put it in the report and all our successes and applauded and so on, but didn't want to help me teach.
How did you feel about that?
It was normal. It was ordinary. I'd already lived for, more than 50 years. I wasn't surprised. That's just how things are.
Was there anything that you didn't like about being a professor?
Well, once I got on tenure track, and especially when I went from assistant to associate and then to full professor, the more that happened, the more meetings and committees I had, and it began to be more, like do reports and take notes at meetings and be on committees and more of that and less teaching. And that just seemed to me so bureaucratic and so counter to the job we were there to do. And so, yeah, I found that frustrating.
So you mentioned that you were the only Native professor, at least for a little while. Did you ever experience discrimination because of that from your fellow professors?
A lot of microaggressions. In some meetings, especially the meetings where we had professors from the other campuses, because University of Alaska Southeast has 3 campuses, so Juneau, Sitka, and Ketchikan. And when we all gathered, then it was more noticeable and even more overt in some of the things that got said and argued. But for the most part, it was just a lot of it was either unspoken or I won't say unintended, but not intended to be so clear.
Do you have any examples?
Well, other than sitting through a lot of meetings where things were where comments were made about the even the worth of teaching pre-college classes, or who, you know, in living in a meritorious society, you know, like the ones, you know, the ones who rise to the top are, you know, are the ones who deserve it, and so on. And being expected to support others, even though my position, I'd been there longer and my position was higher, presumably. And things like that, that were, you know, ordinary life.
Did you ever feel like that was because, well, did you ever feel any discrimination based on your status as a woman, like alone, or as a Native woman combined, if that makes sense?
I as a woman, for sure, for sure. And I'm not the only woman who saw that, especially if we happen to have male deans, which was most of the time. So we, you know, we had women professors teaching creative writing and composition, and then we had the dean of arts and sciences, you know, doing important things. And so the teachers of support classes were usually women, and then the dean was usually a man. That changed after a while, but when I was there, it was men. And yeah, you know, academia is sexist and built on a Eurocentric foundation that, you know, that is perpetuates itself.
So when did you retire?
I think it was like oh geez, like 2019 or something like that. I had a I guess you could call it a catastrophe um, uh, that ended up in me needing to access my retirement so I could pay for all the repair and renovation and cleaning and lawyers and agents and because a house that my family and I were going to buy, and in fact I signed for the mortgage, paid one payment, and it went up in flames and became a just a scar, just a scarred skeleton of a building that took me years to escape. Knock on wood, because it's not quite finished. But I had to access my retirement in order to keep working on it while the insurance and lawyers and city government and all those people decided what they wanted me to do. In other words, my life continued as it always had, because it's always somebody up there deciding what you can and can't do, and that one was a big one. So it's just as well. I sometimes wonder what how it would have turned out had I stayed, because I used to say, I'm going to work. I really loved my teaching job. And I used to say, I'm going to work until noon on the day of my funeral. And I just, I went to, even on the days I had no classes, or, in the hours that my in-class work was done, it was a job to me, and it was a job I loved. And I went, 5 days a week, 6 or 7 hours a day, because I love my job.
Do you ever want to go back and teach again?
No, things are different. Things are different. I did do a couple of online, I think, there, after I retired. But I'm going to Catchment Bay in May, and giving some workshops and classes. So I've done things like that, but no, my life just came this way.
So I know that you've also written a few books. So, and I did you write your first book before you became a professor or while you were a professor?
Before.
Okay.
I wrote it. Well, some of my writing had sorry, some of my writing had sorry.
Okay.
There are places in my writing, my first book for sure, Blonde Indian. I've recently moved, so I don't have the visuals that I usually hold up when I tell this little story. But there are places in Blonde Indian where I can point to that I had written years before. For example, when I was in San Francisco homeless for the last time, which was the summer of 1985, the place that I used to frequent as a homeless woman in San Francisco and downtown in the Tenderloin was St. Anthony's Shelter. And during the day, it was a food line. And then in the evening, it was a shelter for women. And you had to go there at a certain time, take a shower, get ready, and then just sit and wait until, like, I believe it was like 11 o'clock, they began to put the mattresses down and turn the lights down and so on. And so there, during the summer, I recognized other women who were there regularly the way I was. And I would see them on Market Street sometimes, or around the Civic Center now and then. I would recognize the other women that I would see later that evening at the shelter. And so one night I went into, I got some paper towel, very coarse, cheap paper towel, and wrote down my impression of especially one woman that I saw now and then. And I wrote that, and it turned out to be a paragraph in Blonde Indian. And I had written something a couple years before that I dated to, I believe it was 1983, because I put the day and date down. But I traced it back. And I had written something in 1983 on what my students didn't know when I told them it was a typewriter. And you could tell I'd show them where you exit out when on the manual and electric typewriters. That's how you delete things. That's how you used to delete things. And I have that somewhere, and that was from 1983. And my book Blonde Indian was published in 2006. And so years and years later, However, the book had been finished and written, and I was in my first year as an adjunct when I received the when I received the information from the University of Arizona that they were going to publish my book.
How did you feel when you figured out that they were going to publish your book?
I was excited. I didn't know what it was going to mean to my life. You know, I think I'd given up on the impression that all you have to, when you get a book published, you're automatically a millionaire. I think I realized that that wasn't true, but I knew that. Well, not only was I grateful for the recognition, for the impression that that I deserved something, that somebody thought I was worth something. But also I knew on a certain level that that was good for my teaching career. I was more likely to keep getting assignments at the university now that I had a book.
And what was your second book about?
My second book is Tao of Raven, and it takes it tells the story of Raven and the Box of Daylight, and it tells that story throughout by comparing the choices and actions that Raven took, and comparing them to the art of war, the teachings of Sun Tzu on how to wage life. Raven can the choices he made can be interpreted through from the perspective of Sun Tzu's art of war, but I said Tao of Raven because the art of war of Raven, or the art of I couldn't fit that in, but the art of war also agrees with the Tao Te Ching, and so I chose that title, and it also continues the story of Old Tom, who is one of the characters in Blonde Indian. Talks a little bit, picks up something of young Tom, and also revisits some of my earlier memories.
Will you explain to the audience who Raven is for those people who might not know?
Raven is the more than human being, not the whatever you call the highest or most supernatural or something, but one of the important ones. Although he has uncles and a mother, but he is the one who brought us light and brought us dance and fresh water. And in my interpretation, every culture, or maybe almost every culture, develops an image of the supernatural beings that are developed by cultures, in my opinion, reflect the nature that where they live. So Raven is unpredictable, generous, rich, but neither good nor bad, just Raven. And most of the time you can kind of expect what he might do, but also very, very unpredictable, and gives us everything we need to live a good life. So that's that we live in a temperate rainforest, one of the most abundant biomasses on Earth, and so Raven reflects where we live.
Thank you. So what do you like to do now that you're retired? What are some of your hobbies and things that you do now?
Well, I just moved, and so I'm unpacking and sorting and wondering why I kept things and wondering where other things are. And I was, I did have some other things that I had been doing during the winter months, but I'm not working. I I have I have returned to working on my next book. The working title is Bury These Stories, and it is a first person memoir told in the voice and from the perspective of the woman who married a bear, which is another very, very common universal story in many, many cultures worldwide, I'm sure. And it tells her stories.
I'm excited for that to come out.
I'm loving it, but I take so long to write things. It was 10 years between Blonde Indian and Tao of Raven. And Blonde Indian I had been writing for 30 years anyway. So and I'm almost 80, so I'm trying to spend every day writing my new work.
And it sounds like you enjoy it, so that's good.
Well, as a writer, I love my words, right? And so part of my problem is I go back over the first 3 pages, which I just love, and I have like spent hours and hours with like, should that be the or a, right? And so I've spent so many hours just shining and perfecting and polishing that when I go back to see, to continue, I get stuck because I'm just, so enchanted by my own brilliant words and the way I say something. And then on the other hand, I go, oh, it's terrible. I don't, what did I, get rid of all this because I don't know what I was thinking. So that's how I spend a lot of my time.
So speaking of your words, there's a quote from your memoir, Blonde Indian, that I saved. So it says, old traditions have been forgotten. In the old way, women were known to be powerful. Then a new way of thinking was adopted that made it fashionable to look upon women as inferior, weak, and dirty. So will you explain what you meant with that quote to our audience?
Well, in the Lingít tradition, and I'm sure there's similar traditions in other cultures, especially indigenous cultures, when a girl experiences menarche, she is treated as becoming perceived and treated as becoming a woman. And Tlingit society is strictly matrilineal, and generally what do they call it, avunca local or something like that, that generally the boys live by their maternal uncle and girls stay by their mother because it's strictly matrilineal. And in order to know how to be a member of your clan, it has to be modeled for you. When a girl reaches the age and experiences menarche, it's recognized she's going to become a woman, and she is put behind a curtain or in a place isolated from the rest of the community. And the length of time she stays is usually was usually dependent on her status, so that the higher her status, the longer she needed to stay, because in that society and in every society, including the patriarchal, sexist Western society, women have a lot of power. And in Tlingit society, girls were isolated until they learned how to control their power, especially control their words. And so that was their power. Now, in Eurocentric society, when women are considered like not to be spoken of. We don't acknowledge her biological systems and so on, and we don't speak of it. We don't touch her. We follow the biblical model of considering her unclean.
So I started off this interview describing you as a mother, grandmother, and now great-grandmother, and then a retired professor. So how would you describe yourself?
I guess just an 80-year-old Tlingit, 80-year-old Tlingit. Now I've lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, an 80-year-old recluse. I'm a recluse, and I was born on the margin of both worlds. I didn't have a father. My mother wasn't married. My grandparents drank. I really, I was marginalized even by the Native community. And I certainly was marginalized by the white community. My mother was a single woman, and we lived alone after we moved from the old house, and it was just her and me. I was born to be alone, and I am. I still have family here in Juneau. As far as going to things, I think it's a good day when I don't have to go anywhere.
So looking back on all that we've talked about today and all that you have experienced and achieved, what makes you most proud of your younger self?
Oh, I guess that I endured. That even though a lot of it was just, I endured because I didn't have the sense to get away. I endured because I didn't recognize the abuse that the degree of abuse I was experiencing, that I didn't know my own power to make my own decisions. So I think the best that I can say is that I endured.
So as we close our interview, I wanted to thank you again for sharing your story with me and our audience. It was truly a privilege to hear your story, and I'm very excited about the impact that it will have for our Witnesses to Herstory project.
Well, I appreciate that, and I do want to let you know that the things we talked about when we had our phone conversation suggested to me that the discrimination and so on, the practices of society, of the American society during the mid 20th century, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I do want to point out, as I did then, that the face that this program is presenting to the public is primarily white women. And I want to point out, and I think this is extremely important, that especially in California, but continuing in Alaska in certain situations, but especially in California, the discrimination, persecution, and just downright meanness I experienced were from white women who went out of their way to make me uncomfortable, to make fun of me, to make me feel small, and actually, in one case, to look straight at me in a room and say, "No one is here." So to make me invisible. And being invisible is something that we all have to resist. And I feel that one good way to resist that is to place women of poverty, women of color, indigenous women on your public face so that we're not invisible in that regard as well.
Absolutely. I
Thank
agree
you.
100%. Yeah.
Thank you. And I hope you might include that to the message that the women received, because I know that all women, especially, I work with non-Native women here in Juneau, and I know that they appreciate when they realize that looking through a different lens makes everything look different.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I told my professor when we talked last time, I told her, and we are working together to get more of those interviews up on the website. I think we already have some of them now posted. And we, it prompted a lot of conversation in our class, between my professor and I, between me and other people I know outside of our class about the importance of representation. And I really appreciate the fact that you brought it up. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that, because it's important. And, we're doing this one person at a time.
Yes.
Right. So I appreciate you giving me that opportunity and receiving my comments so gracefully.
Of course. Thank you so much. And I
Yeah,
really,
thank
really
you.
did appreciate hearing your story. It was great, and I hope you enjoyed telling it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Of
Gonna
course.
teach.